board texture, a specific situation. For instance, like the board's super drawy and your range looks super weak, it's much more likely that someone's going to fire the river to try and get you to fold. Whereas if it's like a really dry board that looks like you're just never folding, someone's just not going to bluff that much or value bet that late. So you have to kind of apply it to the specific board. I mean, this is a fairly dry board, so again, I don't expect him to barrel this all that much. I'd say probably maybe 40–50% of the time, and that includes his value bets and his bluffs. So, I mean, so if we expect him to bet like 75% of the time on the river, we need 30% equity to call. On average, on the river, we're going to have 35% equity because on average, our turn equity will equal our river equity. And so, let's say this guy bets 40% of the time on the river. So it means 60% of the time he's checking back the river. And when he does bet, we think we'll have roughly 20% equity because he's just not going to be bluffing all that much. And it's probably range between like 15 and 25, but we'll say about 20. So I think those are all reasonable assumptions. Obviously, the more you know about your specific opponent and how often you think they're going to be barreling and whatnot, you can probably get some better assumptions. But really, we're just going for ballpark, just kind of get an idea of how profitable a play will be. So if we've got 20% equity on average when our opponent bets the river, when our opponent checks the river, we'll have 45% equity. And how do I figure that out? Well, it's just kind of a weighted average because we know overall that we're going to have 35% equity on average on the river. So if our opponent's betting 40% of the time and when they bet we get 20%, it's kind of weighted average. Like it has to equal 35% overall. So we look at how often they bet, our equity when they bet, and we know how often they're going to check, and then we can just calculate that. So if that's the case, and they're, which I do think is somewhat reasonable, if that's the case, then calling turn and folding river, which is what we're going to have to do because we don't apply odds to call on the river, it's actually going to cost us roughly $5 to call turn fold river because 40% of the time on the river we have to fold, and some percentage of that time when we do fold, we're folding the best hand. So it definitely cuts into our profit here. If you kind of look at play with numbers a little bit, I mean, let's say our opponent's not bluffing 20% of the time. If they actually are only doing it 15% of the time, then that's good for us because when they do bet the river, that's 40% of the time, it's going to be more value, less bluffs, and so we're folding the best hand less of the time, and we actually do make money. So this is like kind of an average. It's kind of a good overall statement of how much money I'll be making. So I mean, it's pretty much a break-even proposition if I expect this to be sort of a, I guess I keep saying average, but it's sort of an average scenario. But you really want to think about, I mean, to get a specific or really accurate representation of exactly how good of a decision this will be, you'd have to think about every single river card. Like for instance, if the 3 of hearts doesn't hit on the river, if ace of diamonds hits or whatever, well then the ace helps this guy's range a lot because, well, if you look at, I mean, this is the range he's betting the turn with. If he's betting this range on the turn, on an ace river, it's actually doing very, very well. I mean, it's got almost 90% equity versus me. So, if an ace or a king hits, those both help his range a ton. It's a really, really easy fold. If he bets an ace, it's like he's not even bluffing 15% of the time. He just has it so often. So it's a trivially easy fold if he hits an ace. Now, if I hit a jack, that actually helps me a ton. And instead of having 8% equity, I jump up to, I'm the one with 90% equity. So what you would do, is figure out each individual card, what your equity would be. And since there's 46 possible river cards, since we know 4 of them and we've got 2 in our hand, you would figure out what your equity would be on, like, you figure out how often he's betting the river on, say, a blank 3, and which we determine to be, let's say, 40%. On a jack river, he might bet 40% of the time, but instead of having 15% equity, we're going to have a whole lot more. We're going to have like 90% equity. So you would do that for every single card, kind of, and then get an average equity. Obviously, that's a really tedious process. It's really hard to do. But in general, you just want, the biggest thing to take into account is that you shouldn't evaluate the turn and river separately, especially if you can get a general idea of how often your opponent's going to fire the river. You should take into account, because, as I've stated before, anytime you fold the best hand on the river, or you're calling with the worst hand, you're going to be losing a bit of money. So here, you can show that by, if opponent bets river 40% of the time, but they're never bluffing. So when they bet, I literally have 0% equity. Because I'm never folding the best hand, I actually do have $15 in equity by calling turn and folding river, which is the same as I have on the turn, just calling the turn barrel, because if you're never folding the best hand, you're never actually losing any of that equity. So yeah, I think it gives a brief idea without, it's just, like I said, it's extremely hard to really break it down and get an exact number, but you want to have a general idea of how different river cards and different opponents and how often they're going to be betting will affect your turn decision. Ideally, you want this number to be as high as possible, so it gives you a little bit of leeway on the river, because you're just not going to know. It's very, very hard to know an opponent's exact tendencies. If you make a bit of a mistake here, like instead of them betting 40%, if they're going to bet 60% and you've got 20% equity, well then instead of 40% of the time you're folding the best hand, 60% of the time you're folding the best hand, 20% of the time. Anchorman, 60% of the time works 100% of the time. But yeah, the more you have to fold the best hand, the more money you're going to lose. So if he's betting more, you're going to be losing a lot more money. So if that makes sense, we'll go over a couple of hands and just talk about possible things to think about here. Kind of an interesting hand, real quick. Next World Champ. These are guys I've played against a lot. Pretty aggressive players. I've got somewhat of an interesting dynamic with them in the fact that we both, Old Jude, Next World Champ, and I, we've played enough against each other that we've really messed around with each other a lot. 3-bet light, etc., etc. So even though he raised another gun, I think it's fine to 3-bet Ace King here, because I think he'll believe I'm light enough that it's going to be a profitable play. When Old Jude flats, it's interesting because against say a normal reg or someone that I don't know much about, this flat would look extremely, extremely, extremely strong. If you look at it, under the gun raises, under the gun +1 re-raises, and he's just flatting here, not even closing the action. Against most players, I would say this is like 10s plus, maybe Ace Queen plus, if not just Ace King or 10s plus. But I think Old Jude kind of is aware of the dynamic we have. He knows that I'm capable of 3-betting light here, and he also knows he's good enough to know, he's one of the better players at this limit, so he's good enough to know how strong his flat here looks. So he's capable of taking advantage of that information and calling here with a slightly wider range, because he knows he can represent a very, very strong range on the flop. So what he's basically doing here is calling here with the intention of taking advantage of, he expects me to give him a really strong, assign him a really strong range, so he expects to take advantage of that. So anyway, if